Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to come over here and talk to you about something that's pretty exciting to me. So invite any comments or questions anytime. This will, this is kind of an integrated piece of research between ecology and economics. And there's a very definite large climate implication, I think. So I'd be interested to get your feedback on that. So this is joint work with Robert Mendelson at Yale, and then a whole list of other people. I've got a lot of funding from U.S. EPA over the years. I can't acknowledge really that they think this is correct or not correct or whatever, but they have certainly funded a lot of the work that's gone into this at different stages. So appreciate that work, and appreciate the fact that those two people still actually are EPA. I don't understand why they're still at EPA, but they're still at EPA. So the first thing I want to start out with is sort of to talk about, or sort of characterize what I'm going to try to walk through today. So, this picture, you're all very familiar with it. This is emissions of carbon since 1750. This is the IPCC's Working Group 1 picture. Emissions from two sources, industrial sources, cement, et cetera, and then land use being the area in brown. All that carbon has to go somewhere, as we know, so it goes to sort of the IPCC puts into three places: oceans, the atmosphere, and the biosphere. And of course, the one we really worry about is the atmosphere. I think we worry about the oceans as well. I mean, that causes huge harms. We're less worried about the part that goes into the biosphere, but that's going to be the part that I'm going to talk about today. And this interesting question, which is, emissions is from deforestation has been a big chunk of the total carbon that's gone into the atmosphere, and obviously creates the climate problem we have today, and will be with us for a long time. But this sink has increased dramatically in the last century, and if you add up all the numbers, it means that the net increase in forests, that if you actually look at forests over the last 110 years, forests have actually been a net contributor to climate mitigation, actually, on net, even accounting for all this deforestation. So, in reality, the real cause of climate change is not so much deforestation as it is this stuff up here, the industrial sources, right? But so what I want to do, so what Rob and I are really trying to figure out is, what's the cause of this green stuff? So, obviously, carbon fertilization can be one thing that's going on, but is there a management component to that? Is there somehow how humans are managing the landscape and interacting with the landscape, not in forests that are converting between forest and agricultural systems and maybe back, but really between just what's happening on the forested systems themselves. Is there something going on there that's contributing to this large and what looks like an increasing sink? And if so, we think that has interesting sort of climate implications. So, the focus largely has been on deforestation. It is a big contributor to the total amount of carbon up there. That's just a picture of Guyana where there's an active deforestation frontier. And that's where, ever since sort of the COP meeting in 2007, there's been a huge sort of policy discussion about climate change. I'm not going to talk so much about that. I want to talk about instead, why we have this huge sink. So these are kind of the numbers get in scale, the size of this sink. And the sink in terrestrial forests is somewhere around 2.3 gigatons of carbon per year between 2000 and 2007. It's probably about the same size today. So our question is really, what's driving this large and resurgent sink? Is it purely ecological, i.e. carbon fertilization, or is there a management and human response to that? And if it is, how will we actually try to measure what proportion of that is human versus, I'll say indirect anthropogenic, because obviously the carbon fertilization will be anthropogenic as well, but that'd be more an indirect thing. So it's become increasingly obvious that, at least to us, that we can't just think about this interaction across land uses. It's important. I'm not saying it's not important, but that we also have to figure out what's happening within the one kind of land use. That is just, you've got forests that are forests. They're being managed by people and actively managed. And our argument is that there's actually a lot of carbon there that's changing between the atmosphere and the Earth's surface, and that the way we manage that can have an impact on the size of that total sink. And that's what I'll really try to convince you of today. And so, the key thing I wanted to point out is that this management side really influences all types of forests, everywhere from sort of old growth forests in the Pacific Northwest or elsewhere, pure plantations, tropical forests, forests in Ohio, bug infested forests in Canada, et cetera, right? So all of these sort of forests are part of this sort of management picture that I want to try to talk about. So in order to try to convince you of this, I'm going to sort of start with history. And so what we're going to try to do is figure out and see if we can use economics to decompose, what's happened in the last 110 years between 1900 and 2010, basically. So I sort of want to take you on a little historical tour of some of the things that happened in forestry related to that, and use that with a model to then try to decompose the actual numbers and the amount of carbon that's accumulated, and then at the end see if I've convinced you of that. If not, that's fine. I'll keep working at it. So just think of the last century, right? A lot of things happened. Incomes rose dramatically from around $1,200. Last century was really right here, right there, right? From $1,200 per person. This is globally to about $7,500 per person. Population increased dramatically. In the U.S. and in other parts of the world, house sizes increased dramatically, right? So we put did a lot to increase the size of the places we live. Pulpwood expanded. Pulpwood is like it's like the soybean. Soybeans didn't exist in the U.S. really before the 1930s and 1940s, and now they're sort of half the cropland, maybe 2/3 of the cropland within the U.S. You can see this with pulpwood. It didn't really exist until the chemical pulping technologies came about in the 1930s and allowed that to increase the total amount of wood that got used. We also took about 800 million, somewhere between 800 and 900 million hectares of land around the world and converted them to agriculture. That's actually not as important as this other thing. We actually took 500 million hectares somewhere in the world and officially reserved them. We said, no, you can't actually touch those. You're supposed to leave them alone. Some of those are paper parks where it doesn't work so well, but lots of them are here in the U.S. where we're actually pretty good at protecting land, right? So we actually took a lot of land off and away from active timber harvesting and production. New values, and this is a really important thing for environment, reserved huge additional areas of land from timber production. This was private land. This is the entire eastern U.S. So I should say the northeastern U.S. Big chunks of the northeastern U.S. are really now more maintained for environmental purposes by their private landowners than they are for the tree value for timber that they can get off those lands, right? And so we had this huge increase in welfare over that time period. So, what happened to the world's forest? So what I was trying to convince you of is, in fact, actually, forestry became sustainable in a carbon sense. So when I'm using sustainable here, I'm thinking just in a carbon sense. And that's, this is an interesting graph showing in the Pacific Northwest, so the Pacific Northwest of the U.S., Oregon and Washington, what happened to Douglas fir stocks, right? So tracing back stocks of trees back in the 1900s, with the first sort of estimates of those stocks came about really about 1920. We decimated those stocks by harvesting, but we stabilized those stocks starting in the 1970s and 1980s, right? So we actually, while we were drawing down a lot of the carbon, eliminating a lot of it, we started to stabilize it in the 1970s, and we kept a pretty stable stock there. It started to grow recently. The Southeast, we of course went through the Southeast and converted most of that land to agriculture, then let it convert back to trees, and we built up a stock. If you go back into some of the earlier reports, you can actually see that the stock that we have today in the Southeast, the stock of trees on a smaller land area, is bigger than the stock of trees that was estimated to have been there when European settlers first arrived, right? So we actually have more trees and more carbon stock there, they think, today than we had in the early 1700s, late 1600s. So in a carbon sense, forestry has become sustainable despite the fact that we've had a huge increase in demands, right? Huge increase in human consumption over that time period. So one thing that happened, and why is this? One thing that happened is we had, forest expansion. This is just U.S. data showing that the area of trees did increase over that time period. So people converted land from agriculture back to forest. That's one thing that happened. That trend has actually emerged in other places, and excitingly, it's actually starting to happen in South America. You can actually see the data in many places in South America where there was an active agricultural frontier 25 to 30 years ago. Now we're starting to see the same processes happen as we saw in the U.S. And in Russia and in Europe, they're starting to reforest and have an active growth of trees in places they didn't have before. Just as interestingly, harvesting patterns have changed. So we've shifted the age class of harvested trees, and we've also set aside land for economic purpose. So this is an interesting graph which shows the age class distribution of those forests in the Pacific Northwest. And it's today's distribution. 0 to 20-year-old trees, 20 to 40, 40 to 60, etc. And so what's interesting is that there's even anything that's out here, and this is all private land, this is not public land. So what's interesting is there's even land out here, right? Economically, I would argue from an economist standpoint that there's no reason for them to hold old growth trees because they're more valuable to cut down, right? But for some reason, people are able to hold those trees and keep them as old growth trees because they want the, probably privately, they want the amenities that come along with that. That's going to be my guess for why those specific trees exist and why there's a significant amount of them. So there's a good economic explanation for why people are doing that. One of them is that the prices for trees, because we have people who are actively managing this stuff and enhancing the stocks here, prices of trees haven't actually gone up. In fact, they've gone down, right? So folks with these trees are saying, well, given that prices aren't increasing, I'm more than happy to maintain this old growth stock because I get some gain out of it. If prices triple or quadruple, I might rethink my decisions. But as long as folks down here are sort of actively managing this stuff, I can maintain this. And what we all know is in a carbon sense that the amount of carbon per hectare here could be 5 to 10 times the amount of carbon per hectare here. So managing and maintaining this is actually a really good thing from a carbon standpoint. And it's one of the things that will actually enhance the sink today relative to, will enhance the sink today. All right. Other things happening is these forest investments globally have increased dramatically. We've got about 140 to 160 million hectares of plantations, somewhere in the world that have been planted for, just for people to harvest the trees on it, right? So the nice thing about that is, again, is if they're doing that here, then lots of the places that we like to preserve can be preserved because timber prices aren't actually rising. So investments happen. This is just an example of investments increasing in the U.S. throughout the 1900s, mainly in anticipation of the likely loss of old growth forests. People back in the 1930s, by 40s and 50s, not surprisingly, or maybe it is surprising, I don't know, they were thinking about that and saying, you know what, we're going to start running out of trees, so maybe we should start planting them today, and they actually did. Another thing that's happened on these plantations is people have figured out ways to increase the amount of trees they can grow on an annual basis, all right? So the yields, that is calculated in meters cubed per hectare per year, have increased about 1% per year, and in some places like Brazil, 2% per year, the USA, 1.1% per year. So we've seen increases in the amount of carbon that foresters can maintain on this land, right? So they've increased investments to gain that. You think what I'm going to try to do in a second is illustrate how much of this is a function of their management increases and how much is a function of carbon fertilization, because that was actually also going on at the same time, right? So some of that was because these foresters were actively going out there and managing, but some of it was because they were just getting extra carbon from the atmosphere, from our industrial processes. And we'll try to decompose how much was causing that. A third thing, fourth, fifth, whatever thing that actually enhanced carbon stocks was fire exclusion, right? I mean, there's a lot of debate about what benefits fire exclusion has had, but one, I think, undeniable benefit it's had is actually enhanced our carbon stock today. So we had huge areas of fires in the early 1920s, 1930s. After World War II, we decided in the U.S. that we wanted to exclude fires from the landscape in the western U.S. We set about it, we're pretty effective at it, and for a long time maintained relatively low fires. Obviously concerned today that some of those management activities might actually lead to more fires, bigger fires, et cetera, et cetera. If you think about that, it makes sense, right? We've got more carbon out there. So when fires start, there's more opportunity for those fires to burn, just simply because we've excluded it, right? So this is a consistent story with what you hear about fire management, but the positive side of that is actually we have a lot of carbon out there because of that fire management. Then CO2 fertilization, estimated to potentially increase yields in trees by about 20%. Okay, so I'm going to argue or try to sort of convince you now that economics can explain a big part of this growing sink. So natural resource economics models, they provide an idea for how a transition from old growth to renewable resources would occur as demand expands and prices rise. And so this kind of explains the price path. I didn't really explain it earlier, but prices for trees were actually rising at 3 to 4% over most of the last century. They stabilized starting in the 70s and 80s and have become pretty stable since then. So that's consistent with the idea that you're harvesting old growth trees and eventually you're to a renewable resource, and it's sustainable also not just in a carbon sense, but in an economic sense as well. If it were not sustainable, then prices would be increasing still. Plantation forests are another extension of this sort of transition idea, and that they started to be established in the 40s and continue to be established even today. Incentives to manage forests increased over time as population expanded and income grew. That explains a lot of the intensification. And the final thing is if these two things are happening, then we're going to preserve forests out there. And preserving forests, is a good thing from a carbon perspective, because many of the forests we actually try to preserve are the most carbon intense forests. Okay, so I'm going to try to talk through this. We're going to use this thing called this global timber model. So one of the things we've developed here at Ohio State is a large-scale model of the global forest, actually global forested ecosystem. It's spatially specific. We don't really have grid cells, but we have what are called land classes. And these land classes, there's only 250 of them globally. With the way we solve the model, it's a pretty intensive solution process. So 250 is where we are right now in terms of solutions. We can probably double that or triple that, which we'll try to do in the next couple of years. We've coupled this with a dynamic global vegetation model. Especially we do that when we do forward-looking assessments, because we're interested in thinking about how climate change could affect future forests and how people would respond to that. In this case, we've linked it to one dynamic global vegetation model that looks back, the MC2 model. And so the MC2 model has given us information on how forests without humans would have responded. We take that, import it into our model, and figure out how humans would have responded to the climate perturbations over time. We've also got some land demand in there, et cetera, so we can account for the movement of land out of agriculture or out of forest and into agriculture. So we're going to use this model to try to backcast, go backwards from 1910 to 1900, or from 2010 to 1900, to understand what was happening over that time period. So a few, we already saw this, so a few assumptions we have to have in the model is how much did demand grow over time. So we're just using that demand picture that I talked about before. We have to make an assumption about how much carbon fertilization happened. That's easy to do because we have estimates of carbon in the atmosphere. The second thing, though, that we have to figure out is we have to figure out how does the increase in carbon, how does that impact forest growth? So what we've done is use the FACE experiments as reported by Norby et al. These are the free air chamber enrichment experiments, free air carbon enrichment experiments, where they basically doubled the carbon to a bunch of trees that were sort of a living ecosystem, and saw and observed what happened to tree net primary productivity over, I think they had about a 20-year period. And so those results suggest that each 1% increase in CO2 leads to an increase in MPP by 0.65%. So we've added that into our model, and just over the last 110 years, allowed the growth of trees to increase by 0.65% for every 1% increase in the CO2 concentration. So that means there was about a 17% increase in total over that time period. We had to make an assumption about forest fires. So this is where we use that dynamic global vegetation model. That's a model that predicts forest fires, both historically and into the future. And so we use their predictions of forest fires, and perhaps not surprisingly, the biggest forest fire area in the world is Russia, followed by the US. And this is uncontrolled fires. This is what would happen if it weren't for human control. Canada is kind of next. And then Brazil is relatively low levels of forest fires, but not zero. So this is one of the inputs into the model that we've accounted for. Land use, we've also accounted for that. So we're using Houghton's data. We sort of trying to keep track of where deforestation occurred in all parts of the world. So our model sort of tracks these deforestation components. All right, so results, so we stick all this stuff into the model and then try to backcast or project historically and simulate the history. So this is our price projection. So real prices are here. Our prices are smooth. We would never, with our model, be able to get kind of bumps up and down. Ours is always going to be sort of a 10-year average. So we fairly well repredicted historical prices. I feel pretty comfortable with that. Our harvesting is not exactly the same as FAO data, which is the sort of central information on harvesting globally. But we've looked at how that would impact if we were off by a little bit on our carbon calculations. It turns out it wouldn't impact our carbon calculations too much because it turns out the harvesting actually isn't the most important thing here. Forest management, I didn't put the actual numbers for plantations, but we've actually been able to simulate pretty well the establishment of plantations historically. We have no numbers globally on how much money, this is money people have spent on forest management. We don't actually know that historically, so this is a pure guess. And it's something we can't actually calibrate to. So most of the other things we can calibrate to. Land areas we're able to calibrate to. So, one of the things that's happened, just think about the world, and this is sort of what's happened to the world's forest areas. They've gone down by about 700 or 800 million hectares in total. So we've lost land and forest. If we decompose that into three kinds of forest areas: primary forests, moderately managed forest, and intensively managed forest. We can see what's happened is we've reduced and lost a significant amount, about 1.1 billion hectares of primary forest. So that's the natural sort of old growth stuff. We've gained, so we've shifted some of that to moderately intensively managed forests. That would be things like hardwoods in the southern US. Western US. And you see where it's happened sort of between North America, rest of the world, et cetera, right? So these numbers actually fit pretty well with data we can actually look at. Deforestation, just to show our numbers are calibrated fairly well to Houghton's numbers. All right, so here's where we get into the carbon story and how we're going to try to decompose how our carbon story and how much of that carbon increase that happened in these forests was a function of management versus fertilization. Okay, so this is emissions of carbon. This is Houghton's data. So if you think of that brown area in the original graph we showed, the brown area, which was the total emissions from deforestation, that's what this number is. This is the net number. So if you were to put together, that brown number and the green area, you would get this line. And this is our reprediction of it. So we're not perfect. We haven't perfectly repredicted it with our model. We could never really be perfect, but we should be a little closer than that. So we're trying to get closer, and that's one of the things that's taken us a while to get publication with this, is getting that just a little bit better. I guess as academics, we always want to be perfect, but I don't know. What's the old saying? Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I don't know. What is that what the right saying is? Yeah. Anyways, okay, so now the question is how much of this is our line we just talked about. This is our prediction of the net effect of all deforestation in the world and all the management processes in forestry and carbon fertilization, their influence on carbon, so it's the net effect. So what we can do, so the reason why we're trying to do this is because then we can go back and ask the question is what would have happened if there had been no carbon fertilization, right? So we just take carbon fertilization out of there. So, and then repredict the model and see what a difference that makes. Alternatively, I can take management out, forest management out, and see what difference that makes. All right, so that's what these two sort of pictures are up here, two lines are up here. So the big line is no fertilization. That gets you almost back up to where Houghton was, not quite, but a pretty high level of carbon. And this is with no management. So no management. So this is with carbon fertilization, but not allowing people to manage the forests, right? So they still harvest the forest though. All right, so we can see that we would have less carbon. In fact, if we hadn't either had carbon fertilization or we hadn't had management, forest would have been a net source over that time period rather than the net sink that they actually are. And so, we think that's a useful thing, but we want to think more about how that, how we can actually reallocate, how we say which portion of this net sink is a function of management versus carbon. And this is where, you can never completely disentangle the two, unfortunately, because if you think about yourself as a forest manager, and this is, I don't want to argue, this is actually the agricultural problem too. So when you think about agriculture, right, we've got all these great yield increases, right? And what do we attribute most of those yield increases to? Say for corn or soybeans or something like that. We attribute it to the use of nitrogen, right? That is, since the 1930s, when we started to have hybrids, we added a lot of nitrogen to agriculture, and we started to get these yield increases of 1% to 2% per year that have gone on, places like the U.S. for virtually, 80 years, uninterrupted. And we attribute most of that to our ingenuity and brains in terms of nitrogen, but it also might have been carbon, right? That is, it depends kind of on what the limiting nutrient actually was. And if carbon was a limiting nutrient to, say, soybeans, which are a C3 crop, then it might have been just as important. That nitrogen may not have had as much of an effect if it hadn't been for the carbon, right? So it's the same thing with forests. How do you actually disentangle or think about a forester out there asking themselves, and foresters, by the way, just like agriculture, most forests in the U.S., especially in the southern U.S., get a heavy dose of nitrogen every year, at least up to the year 15 or so. So southern pine forests, most of those sites are actually nitrogen deficient, and so they're using about the same 140 pounds per acre that agriculturalists are using to get extra yield. So you think about it, you're a forester out there, and you're thinking, well, I got to add nitrogen. What's interesting is if you hadn't had the carbon fertilization, that adding of the nitrogen wouldn't have actually done anything, right? So, the point of that is that it's really, really hard to just completely disentangle what's a management thing versus what's a carbon fertilization thing. We'll do our best here, but it's really hard to disentangle those two things historically. Okay, so this is our attempt to do it. So we took these numbers, sort of added them up, and asked the question, what portion, when you go from the deforestation, the total amount of carbon that was stuck in the atmosphere from deforestation versus the net, which is our estimate, right? How much of that was a function of carbon fertilization versus forest management versus what we're going to call natural regrowth? That is, some people plant trees and don't manage it. They don't add nitrogen. They don't go in and do thinning and other kinds of operations that enhance or change the type of tree. So natural regrowth is another kind of management, but it's less intensive than the real intensive forest management, right? So what we found is that, carbon fertilization is, the difference between this and this is about 125. This is about 35%, something like that, of the gain in carbon over the last 110 years. Really strong forest management is, maybe about 15 to 20%. This idea of just planting trees was a huge chunk of it, that if we didn't actually plant any trees, we would have a lot less carbon, right? So it turns out that these two things are as big as carbon fertilization when we look at the entire time period, the entire amount of carbon. So it's, we think that's a useful finding, that in fact, actually what we're doing on the landscape is as important as the carbon fertilization that we got. Now, a different way to think about this is to ask, and this is just data for the U.S. So the U.S. right now, if you look at our inventory numbers, and actually, so if you go back and you look at when we used to have climate policy in the U.S., we had the Clean Power Plan, and we were planning on trying to meet the Paris Accord. One of the, actually 30% of us meeting the Paris Accord was a function of what was happening in forests. So in other words, we had all this, we needed to reduce our net emissions by 26%. And the idea the Obama administration came up with was it would probably be too expensive to get that full 26% by 2025. It'd be too expensive to do it all in the industrial sector. So they said, let's use what we get in forestry to offset some of that carbon so we can have to do less in the industrial sector. And it turns out that that was about 30% of it. So they're vitally interested in how much of this sink in forests will continue to be there. And they actually also want to know, can management actually enhance that sink? So it's useful to know how management enhanced it in the past. So that's what this does. We got two time periods, 1995 and 2005, using our historical model, and asking the question, how much of that annual sink, that annual flux of carbon in the forest, was contributed by these different components, either carbon dioxide fertilization and climate change, or forest management. So let's just look here at this data. So we start out by asking the question, well, what would have happened if we just had, from 1900 to 2010, people managing forests, but we didn't have any of the carbon fertilization? How much carbon annually would we had by 2005? And it would have been about 27 teragrams of carbon per year. So that would have been the size of the sink in the US. And we asked the question, well, okay, let's add in management and add in climate change. How much would we have had? It would have been about 137 teragrams or million tons of carbon per year. Okay, and then we asked the question, what's the difference between these two? And that's about 115 million tons. So we sort of reckon that that's the effect of climate change, right? That's the benefit of climate change. Then we asked, okay, so how much would we lose if we took away different forest management components? And this is where, we wanted to look at specific forest management components. There's just that forest management part. This is the foresters going out and putting fertilizer on their trees, changing their seed stock to hybrids and improved species, shifting from hardwoods to softwoods, et cetera, et cetera. We look at forest management as well, or fire management. That's a really important part of U.S. forestry management, is managing fires. How much, if we hadn't done that, would we not have had, right? And then finally, that regeneration part. What if no one ever went out and planted a tree in the last century? How much would we have lost? So it turns out, yeah, we would have actually, if we got rid of all of those management things, all three of them, and still had climate change, it wouldn't have actually helped us a lot. We would have had a positive net flux by 2005, but the net flux would be really fairly small, right? Remember, this is just this is 1 year, right? This is just 1 year's flux. So it turns out that by 2005, that if we hadn't done any of these things, any of these management things, it really would have harmed us in terms of trying to meet this sort of Paris Agreement or any kind of thing today. And we can sort of look at what the different parts would have had, or the impact of the different parts. We would have lost about 37% if we just hadn't done that real strict forest management. If we hadn't done fire management, it turns out it wouldn't have much of an effect by 2005. And that's an interesting one. Fire management had a huge effect on the amount of land that got affected by fires. But by 2005, it wasn't actually a big part of the carbon flux story in the US. And the reason for that is most fires happen in the West, and they're actually a small part of the carbon flux. Most of this carbon flux in the US is really in the East, and we have a lot, fewer fires in that particular region, right? So this is kind of where we come up with, 30 to 40% of that flux today, or the carbon sink today, is likely due to human management, not so much just that carbon fertilization part. Okay, so the conclusion on that is that carbon fertilization can only explain about 40% of the cumulative sink. Forest management is likely 20 to 60%. We'd like to pin that down more, but we really haven't figured out a way to disentangle perfectly. How much of this management part is really management versus response to carbon fertilization. So we'd like to figure that out. So take a little more work to do that. It's a critical part of the U.S. carbon sink, and probably the most important part, forest management, is of the current sink. So more of the total CO2 emissions in the atmosphere is due to the energy sector. So the real implication is that a lot of people would like to attribute deforestation to a big chunk of the carbon in the atmosphere, but in fact, if you add in the afforestation that's happened afterwards and this component of management, deforestation's it's a less important thing. I don't want to say deforestation is not an important thing necessarily, but if you're looking for solving the climate problem, avoiding deforestation is not the most important thing. It's probably still dealing with the energy sector, right? So that's kind of an implication here as well. A couple things looking forward. Will these forests still be a sink? We got a lot of other demands. So our work suggests, and so we take the same model and go forward with it. I just want to show a couple slides from that, just to give you a sense of what we're saying about the future with that, is that this fairly large sort of sink globally will decline over time. But in the US, it stays fairly constant. That's mainly because we continue to manage things here in the US. But the sink does slow down over time, but it still remains a sink through most of this coming century. US forest sequestration happens largely in managed places. So much of the sequestration that we see right now, much of this, what we have in fertilization or going on in the US today, is partly in some areas that are unmanaged. So this sounds confusing, so I just argued that management was really, really important, right? So remember that one of the benefits of management, and one of the most important benefits of management of forests, is the fact that it allows people who don't want to manage their forests to just leave them alone. Right? If prices were rising, then people would be knocking at their door every day asking them to cut their trees down. But it turns out that not that many people ask people to cut trees down in lots of parts of the northeastern US, because the trees really aren't all that valuable, right? The reason they're not that valuable is because somebody else out there who has much more productive stuff is able to produce those trees at a reasonable cost in another place, right? So we get this huge amount of stuff, which I'm going to say carbon sequestration, on what I'm calling unmanaged land. We get a decent amount of it simply because we do a lot of management, actually, right? That, I don't know, that may be a confusing argument. If it is, let me know. Climate change actually turns out doesn't. Uh-oh. So want me to shut up? It's okay. It's like you pulled the hook. I was telling Kevin, I went to the Rotary Club this morning, and they had the most interesting thing. When I babbled on too far, first the lights went down, and I kept babbling on because no one got up to leave. Then they just started clapping. It was great. So if you want me to stop, just start clapping. Okay, it's great. Or not, just walk out. That's stuff too. This is too confusing a graph, but the point is looking at the future with climate change. You know, at least in our estimates, using, and this is just using a series of 4 different vegetation models. We don't find that actually forests are heavily harmed. I should say the carbon in forests. I wouldn't say that forests aren't heavily harmed, but the carbon in forests isn't heavily reduced by climate change. That's all this number is. And that's an important distinction because forests will experience lots of potential harms from climate change. But this idea that we can keep managing them to maintain carbon in them is all our result is saying is that seems very feasible, given all the perturbations that could potentially happen from climate change across just the 4 DGVMs that we looked at. You know, so that's a useful thing. It doesn't mean they're not harmed. So, you know, in conclusion, management is critical for carbon sequestration and the preservation of forests. Climate change can reduce sequestration, but most scenarios actually suggest the other direction. And then markets actually are. This is one case. This is actually one case where consumption may actually benefit us in terms of making a resource sustainable in a carbon sense. So that doesn't mean there aren't impacts and negative impacts to ecosystems and biodiversity and other kinds of stuff. Remember, this is just in a carbon sense. And that this management can be maybe up to 30% of the abatement over the next century. This could be actually an important component that helps us mitigate climate change in the future. So with that, I'll stop and open up to any questions, comments, which I would very much appreciate.